How to teach a European history of revolution and terror? That is the question for today. How to teach about the waves of violence that shaped history. With Pieter Geil, a Dutch historian, we can safely say that this is a discussion without an end. Yet there is more freedom to start with a specific moment in time as a beginning. So for me, as a professor of modern history, I cannot help but start with the Atlantic revolutions, and for the history of Europe in particular with Napoleon. And I'm not alone in drawing that historiographical line as a watershed. Both Geil and the grand German historian Thomas Nipperdey started their works with Napoleon. Am Anfang war Napoleon. In the beginning was Napoleon. The Great Terror continued into the armed Jacobinism of the Grande Armée that redrew the map of modern Europe. So should we therefore start with him? And how does that help us to teach a truly European history of revolution and terror, to summarize the chapters in our handbook that are devoted to these themes? As one of the contributors, I did my best in designing some approaches that help us do exactly this. So let me highlight 3 questions to you today with which we struggled and that may also interest you as teachers of European history. The first question is the question where to start. The second one is on how to understand the violence from a historicizing point of view rather than from a post hoc teleological one. And the third question is how to make it truly European. So I will share with you 3 pivotal discussions, debates on how to write a history of terrorism, revolution, civil war in the modern era. It gave us as contributors to the handbook a lot of headaches, but also new insights. So the first question, how to start? Yeah, where to start and how to start? We had lengthy debates on this. Do we start with revolutions that have been solidified in classic historiography as revolutions, with revolutions that were seen and described as such by contemporaries, or with any other type of upheaval that occurred as corollaries of war and conflict, and that are rather types of revolution in our imagination and perception, than that they were the intended outcomes in the time itself of a systemic overthrow. So revolutions by accident, are they truly revolutions? Well, in our chapters, the choice has been to look back in time through the lens of our modern present day notions, definitions of revolution. For example, chapter 3.3.1 on civil wars says that civil wars are presumably as old as human history, and revolutions are not. There may well have been revolutions, to be sure, before the term was first used ironically, in a rather unrevolutionary event, the Glorious Revolution of England in 1688. But to talk of a revolution as opposed to, say, to a mere spontaneous rebellion, is to talk of a takeover of central power in a state, which in turn requires that some form of centralized state exists in the first place. Well, and this was not the case, obviously, in Europe before the late Middle Ages, although states had also existed in ancient times, and events took place that might qualify as revolutions. Some regions of Europe were more precocious than others, of course, especially those in the south. The Sicilian Vespers of 1282, a bloody event which saw Sicilians drive their French masters from the island, may well have been the first revolution, properly speaking. It also shows another important feature of revolutions, participation of parts of the population and not just of a small elite in overthrowing a regime. Otherwise, if it's only the elites, we might more fittingly speak of a coup d'état, a putsch or a palace revolt, which is not the same as a revolution. Yet by contemporaries, many of the so-called revolutions were not at all seen as such. Sometimes they were seen as a civil war, for example 1688 between Catholics and Protestants, as a dynastic revolt, as a foreign invasion. Jonathan Israel has expressed himself against placing this event, the Glorious Revolution, in the pantheon of revolutions, since it was merely an invasion, he says, to prop up a new Protestant king. Interestingly, only 2 decades later, 20 years, the event was put in the annals as a glorious revolution by Protestant preachers. And then it was sealed in historiography as the revolution by historians in the 19th and 20th century. But not all of them agree on what the revolution was exactly about and whether it fits the model of a modern, forward-looking revolution, overthrowing an old regime, upending socio-economic strata society and ushering in a new age. To many revisionists in the 1970s, the 1688 revolution most certainly did not. So, as you see, it's not that easy as it seems. And aren't we as historians running the risk of falling in the trap of pretending to be social scientists? Following modern-day models, schemes and charts of revolution and civil wars, teleologically looking back in history to find traits and features that fit our models today. It could be the models of Tilly, Charles Tilly, Hannah Arendt, of Theda Skocpol. This is a question that I'm not going to answer. You have to answer for yourself, but it is a trap. That brings me to the second question. How to properly historicize terror and revolution? In a sense, this also is partly an answer to the first question, historicize the revolution. I'm not going to do that now with revolution, but with terror. Also a concept that runs the risk of being caught in too much presentist debate. So let me start with the example of the concept of phenomenon of terror, something that features in chapter 3.3 of the handbook. Recently, some scholars, and I count myself amongst them, have started to situate the origins of modern terror not in the late 19th century, which is, for example, heavily consolidated by the theory of the 4 waves of terrorism conceived and presented by David Rappaport. It has been copied by many historians since, Richard Bach-Jensen, Jens Jäger, Martha Crenshaw, Petra Terhoeven. No, we thought that it may be better to start with the French Revolution itself. Klaus Ries, the German historian, wrote in a recent excellent paper that we are on the one hand accustomed to regarding the French Revolution as the beginning of the history of modern violence, but we do not really study terror and revolution in this way, taking the French Revolution as the starting point of such a genealogy. Yet, he writes, quote opens, the French Revolution nonetheless marked a watershed in the use of political violence because it uncoupled violence from its traditional religious or other conditions, demonstrating to 19th century terrorists how this weapon could be used. So in short, not the glorious revolution fits the model of a modern day revolutions, but only really the French Revolution, and it also coined the term terror in the modern secularized way as we still know it today. So indeed, we could look back in history, would find countless political revolts, attacks, coups and political murders since antiquity. But the French Revolution made it possible, according to Klaus Ries again, I quote again, to choose the extreme means of a terrorist attack for something other than religious motives, end quote. Thus, historical research stylizes the French Revolution as a secular break in the history of terrorism, which marks the beginning of modern terrorism as a modern phenomenon. So then that question could perhaps be answered. Shouldn't we therefore start the history of terror and revolution as discourse and category of intended political change with the French Revolution? I think the answer would be yes. And there is even a better way of answering this question as an historian, not by answering it in the third-person observant position that I have adopted, but applying a first-person perspective. Ask ourselves when the people at the time started to refer to their times, and the first-person perspective, as revolutionary or terrorist. And when did they start talking about terror in such a secular way? Well, to give you an example, my own research, empirically, as I've studied this in the Dutch journals, the first references to modern secular terror, révolution et terroriste, oftentimes in French, can be found in the years immediately after 1795. Before the French Revolution, terreur, had been part of the political vocabulary as well, is mentioned in the journals, but back then, and this interpretation sort of continues in public texts throughout the 19th and 20th century, it had delineated that phenomenon with the righteous, salutary and majestic terror of God. So terror was the divine concept, the capacity of gods and princes to install fear in their enemies. The victims of this type of terrorism were indiscriminately chosen. Enemies at the gates, foreign armies, invaders. By the way, this is also the way in which the opponents in the age of the glorious revolution tried to delegitimize each other. Each saw himself as the righteous divine king and the others as demons, as enemies that could and should be terrorized. But since Robespierre's reign of terror, the concept had morphed into a secularized version. It was now not the terror of God or the gods, but the terror of the people, the tyranny of the multitude, a term of abuse that could be used to discredit political adversaries alike. A revolution became the term to signal one's political preference for a radical overthrow or for going back, restoration of the ancient regime order and existing rule of law. So in Dutch, in French, English, German discourses, references to terrorism pointed to the French revolutionary or Bonapartist system of governance without law. In their words, it could indicate fanatism, Jacobinism, despotism, and in the Dutch journals, French terror was sometimes, or French terror in the Netherlands, or Dutch people adopting French practices. It was coined as Batavian terror after the Batavian Republic that was inaugurated in the French times, but just before the French time. Moreover, through the revolutionary Napoleonic Wars, the semantical field of terrorism became connected to chaos, disorder and anarchy as well, next to revolution. And the securitizing subject of this reign of terror could point in two directions. The terrorizing actor could be the government, engaging in terror and abuse of power towards the population, or it could be the radicals, aiming at revolutionizing society and overthrowing the government. And what was being terrorized, the securitizing object, not the subject but the object, was far more difficult to delineate. It could be the heads of states, the kings and queens that were literally beheaded under the guillotine. It could also be the whole existing order that was in danger, that needed to be sacrificed in the eyes of the terrorists for the birth of a new salutary reign of the people. Very briefly, intermittently, it's how President George Bush, the second one, coined the terrorist attacks of 9/11. It's, in his phrasing, they were attacking our culture, our society, our values. So he broadened the object of the terror threat. This is something that happened, or started to happen, in the 1790s as well. And after 1793, with the transnational spread of the scare of Robespierre's regime of terror as a threat throughout Europe, threatening the fabric of society, that continued in the terror inflicted by Napoleon's armies after 1803, this was how terror became consolidated in discourse. There are reports on these instances of repression, violence by means of military bulletins that used the term, and terror became the term and also a unifying force for collective scares and moral outrages. And the object of this fear was easy. All the countries of Europe that were targeted by the Grande Armée itself, their autonomy, their independence, their populaces, their grain, their taxes, their young men that became fodder for Napoleon's terror machine, the army itself was considered as a target of the Napoleonic terror. Subsequently, with the march of the Allied armies from 1812-1813 onwards, a progressive institutionalization of collective security policies to combat, neutralize and fend off terror, both in its revolutionary and its Napoleonic guise, were embraced. You can find that in the archives, in the documents, in the peace treaties that marked the end of the Napoleonic Wars, culminating in the final Act of Vienna from June 1815. But even more explicitly in the Quadruple Alliance Treaty of November 1815 and the Paris Peace Treaty. Those treaties created an international system based on international law that defined security as a collective obligation, referring both to the geopolitical challenge to restore the so-called balance of power and the domestic context of preventing revolutionary unrest from erupting ever again. So in 1815 at the Congress of Vienna, even more so after the return of Napoleon, the 7th of March, and the 100 Days regime, terror was considered and described and prohibited as the combined force of Napoleon's Grande Armée and the elite Jacobin spirit behind this drive for expansion and usurpation. As Chancellor Metternich called it, this was armed Jacobinism. And terrorists were both those in state power wanting to upend the balance of power and invade neighbor countries, and Napoleon and his forces, but also non-state actors, the countries outside France that wanted to copycat events in France. So the result of this was that war, revolution, now became institutionalized, embedded in notions of a European framework of treaties where hegemonic power, revolutionary war was considered outside the pale of European civilization. That's exactly how it was described in the treaties. So that helps us responding to this second question, how to historicize revolution and terror. Well, start with the ways and means people at the time described the threat object, and wrote alarmist reports about it. Not to say that this was a truly concrete revolution or war, but it's how people voiced and their fear and translated it into law and frameworks and treaties and the like. So that brings me to my third question. How to make the teaching of terrorism, revolution, terror a truly European endeavor? Well, this last question is a difficult one, because how can we teach revolution terror, which is so much situated in a specific country at the time, how can we teach it in a transnationally way without being boxed in by reductionist nationalist narratives again? So it's one thing to state that the revolutions were transnational, that they were contagious, that Atlantic revolutions took place worldwide, that political transfer happened, but another to apply it to teaching practices, how to teach from a truly European perspective. In our chapters, we have tried to offer an approach by situating the narrative, I'm now talking about chapter 3.3 again, not in one country, France, Spain, Germany, but in the international sphere as such. I quote a passage from our book. At the same time, from the age of revolution onwards, a codification of international public law, of international humanitarian law, and the rules that guide military conduct took place. From the 1815 treaties onwards, via the first official treaty codifying international humanitarian law in 1820, up until the Hague Convention of 1907 and the Nuremberg Tribunals of 1945, a juridification of customary laws of conduct in war, of permissive rights, prohibitive rights, was formulated. So there was now a body, acquis communautaire of the European countries regarding law and treaties on conflict, war, terror and revolution. So according to the classic Whiggish viewpoint, this development was the outcome of a process driven by universalist ambitions and human rights ideals. But it could also be considered a contingent and an open-ended reconfiguration of imperial interests, public pressure, interstate, inter-empire competition and cooperation up until the present day, with the definition of terrorism being wielded by authoritarian and populist leaders as a stick to hit their domestic opposition with. So this is how we described it in our handbook. So what we try to do here is offer not a classic nationalist narrative that writes history through the lens of deterministic progress of a nation state towards its end state, namely democracy. No, we try to bring in histories of truly European bodies, so international, supranational bodies, organizations, committees that were established at the time itself to deal with war, terror and revolution by the contemporaries themselves. I think this is an important way of teaching European history, but following the lead of Professor Glenda Sluga, who did exactly this with her beautiful book Inventing International Order, or Susan Pedersen, who focused on the international agents of the League of Nations mandate system in The Guardians. And we could also bring in not the institutions, but also the material culture. We could borrow from Brian Vick, who tried to present the European culture of paraphernalia, monuments, music, symbolizing the return of peace and the end of war and a stable balance of power after 1815. In my book, Fighting Terror After Napoleon, I also did not focus on the individual governments, ministers and generals, but I stitched together the protocols of the Allied Council, a kind of a proto-NATO council that was established in July 1815 to oversee the occupation of France, the drafting of the Paris Treaty and the Quadruple Alliance, and that put into practice transnationally the Congress of Vienna's ideas on balance of power, peace and anti-terrorist politics. So looking back in history, it helps to teach about truly multilateral platforms, and we can still focus on the individual contribution of countries, but I'm certain to develop more fine-grained, innovative European historians, we have to teach about European bodies themselves. And they were there in ample ways. For example, we could think about the Joint Committee to Fight Piracy, described by Erik de Lange, Solve the Greek Question, Christos Aliprantis, and others are working on this, discuss the Belgian uprising, the postal system, hygienic measures, quarantine experiments. Ozan Ozavci and Andrea Wiegeshoff did research about this. And this all brings so many added values and innovative results to European history and to the teaching of European history. So by studying, teaching about platforms of multilateral deliberation, we can also, in line with the first question, where to start, bring in the course of first-person perspectives on the gliding scales of types of violence that were involved in European history in the 19th, 20th century, because the Europeans back then were also working together to deal with them. For some governments, the revolution was considered a war declaration. The Dutch considered the Belgian Revolution 1830 as such. For others, it was a mere domestic request for reform for London, or a revolt that needed to be put down in Prussia, Russia. Moreover, in studying European history, from this perspective, we can also overcome the distinction between domestic histories of constitutional reform, many Whiggish sort of interpretations of history that see Europe move from restoration via revolt to reform and revolutions in the 19th century. No, I think it should be handled differently. The revolutionaries fighting for more civil rights in their own country, they were oftentimes the same ones that unleashed expansions outside of their countries, and they demonstrated ambition for empire elsewhere. The French did in the 1840s, the British, the Belgians. So it's also important, if you teach European history on war, conflict, terror, revolution, first of all, not to stay put in nationalist narratives, but also to avoid staying put in the dichotomies of domestic political history, international political history, security history, because it was so much intertwined back then as it is still today. Violence spreads across borders. Violence spreads across disciplines. It touches on law, the police, the army, militia. Enacting as a nation state as Europe, enacting violence abroad as an empire, it could all tie into together. Lauren Benton and Lisa Ford have tried to demonstrate exactly this entanglement of empires, of nations, of domestic and external foreign violence and security in their book Rage for Order, how the British Empire created new legal regimes abroad and how that hit back home as well. So moreover, in this fashion, we can also demonstrate how war, civil wars, revolution and terror, they were no discrete categories, as political scientists often describe and map them, that stopped at the moment peace treaties were crafted. No. With Robert Garward in chapter 3.3, we show how the First World War in our chronologies and timelines may have ended in 1918 in Western Europe, but the violence, the terror, the revolutions continued until the 1920s in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. And studying the multilateral platform of the Paris Peace Conference, or the Conference of Ministers that was inaugurated in 1919, sheds light on these manifold manifestations of ongoing slaughter and violence, where domestic violence, foreign violence, nations, empires, all became confused and entangled. We think that it's important to show the transboundary, the fluid character of war, revolution, conflict and terror. Given the present-day examples of hybrid warfare by Russia, the war in Syria, in Ukraine, it's only all too clear that such ambivalent situations and difficult delineations persist into our age. They need to be addressed not just by political scientists, but also by us historians in truly historical perspective. To conclude, let me point to some clues and cues that helped us in writing our chapters and that may also be of some use for you in writing European histories of war, violence, terror, revolution. A few remaining points. The first point, we need to steer clear as historians from quick and dirty political scientist-like solutions to historiographical challenges. That's far too easy to just take a theory or a model about revolution and apply that to the medieval ages. What's the sense of that, doing that? Second point ties in with this. We need to abstain from Whiggish interpretations of history. We should not teleologically consider revolutions as the only necessary outcome. It could also be a setback, it could be a glitch of history. And then the third point, historicizing notions of war, revolution and terrorism helps us to avoid these pitfalls. How did contemporaries understand and discuss these violent events, these disruptive events in their own terms? When did they start to talk about revolution and terror and what did it mean to them? Another point, studying violence not just as a theory, but also as a practice helps. So not just high over models, but the real threat perception, the interest articulation, the practices that evolved from them by the contemporaries should be mapped. No essentialist concepts, but how these concepts, how for example security or terror were translated, articulated in material and practical elements. In borders, Lorena de Vita gave a class on borders. In fortifications, in uniforms, in flags, also helps us. And we also should not rely on secondary literature textbooks, but applying first-person perspectives based on archival sources, for example, more. We should borrow from social scientists, yes, but to make stories more pertinent and endeavor by beyond the descriptive analysis, we should also consider the first-person perspective and put that out there in clear and concise ways. For example, how does it matter that Putin repeatedly portrays himself as a Tsar and channels Byzantine repertoires of sacrifice and redemption? It's important to understand what he means. If Putin is discussing Europe, what kind of Europe does he mean? My last point is perhaps a bit difficult, but also important, not the least important, I would say. It's how to bring in, how to be explicit about our own normative framework in teaching revolution and terror, war and conflict. Because as pedagogues of history know, every history is not just a history of facts and events, it's also a history of significance. Significance is a highly subjective notion. The one's revolution, the one's terrorist attack is irrelevant to another person. For a student from Morocco or Turkey, the one attack is completely more relevant for him or her than a terrorist attack in the UK, for example. Do we reckon with that? How do we select and present our cases? And how do we embed them in the normative framework that is supporting the open democracies of the world? And in the end, teaching a European history also involves teaching about the norms and the pillars of that framework as it came into existence. Thank you very much.